Our next speaker is Katrien, and she'll be presenting on explaining and exploring job recommendations, a user-driven approach for interacting with knowledge-based job recommender systems.
Hello everyone, my name is Katrien. It's my pleasure to present our work today on explaining and exploring job recommendations. We elaborated this work in collaboration with VDAB, which is a public employment service of Flanders. The problem that we are addressing here is that job recommender systems pose some additional challenges. One of the things that we observe now is that the labor market is very rapidly evolving, and that jobs are often composed of a very diverse set of tasks, and that of course poses some additional challenges. Job seekers are often not aware that they have a skill set for completely different jobs, even maybe their dream job that they could apply for, but they often don't know that they have this particular skill set. So that's why we are researching how we can provide effective recommendations in this context. And the needs that we see is that there's a need for increased diversity, but there's also a need to explain better the recommendations so that end users see how their skill set matches the competences that are asked for in different jobs, and to put the end user into control, to put them in the steering wheel, and so that they can explore the labor market and see how they would fit. How do we address this challenge? We are researching how we can visualize recommendations. Key goals are, as I explained, explaining the recommendations so that end users can see their competence match, but also providing better exploration and interaction support for end users. Research questions that we are addressing is, first of all, do these visualizations empower users to better understand and find recommendations, but also do personal characteristics such as background and age come into play when we look at user perception and user interaction. We looked at some inspiring examples. For instance, the first one that you can see here on the slide is LinkedIn from John Donovan's group, and here you see similar ideas. You have skills, you have competences, you see connections in the middle, you see then the recommendations. Users can see these skills and they can even tweak them. Also, set fusion, elaborated by Dennis Parra and Peter Brzulovsky. Same idea, you have recommendations, you have input parameters, and you try to visualize to what extent they overlap and to what extent they explain the recommendations. And then evidently we also looked at job applications where the focus is often, for instance, on heat maps to give insight into the labor market. This is the final design of the tool that we elaborated. It's an interactive dashboard where we looked at the key goals, exploring and explaining recommendations, but I'll go into the details a bit later. We followed the user-centered design process. We started with focus groups with both job seekers and job mediators. And they, in the first step, they had to look at the knowledge-based recommender system that VDAB is using. They had to rank the different parameters. Then we did co-design sessions. Based on that, we developed 2 prototypes. We did think aloud studies, and we then came up with a final prototype that we evaluated with 66 job seekers. This is the result of the focus groups, where you can see how important job seekers and job mediators ranked the different parameters. Job title and distance were ranked very frequently first. Distance was very important, and also the typical job title, still considered very important. But also many of the other parameters were ranked. As you can see, also competences, languages, studies were ranked by the participants. We then came up with different designs. This is just a subset of the designs that we elaborated. What you can see is that in many of the cases, of course, distance and location was given a prominent place as users requested this. And we also visualized the competences. We visualized the competences that the job seeker has, and also the competences that may still need to acquire. We iterated over these, we acquired further feedback, we did a first prototype, a second prototype, and then based on all that input, we came up with these final design goals. First was exploration. End users very much, definitely if you increase the diversity of recommendations, they want to be in control. They want to indicate what is of interest to them. Second of all, they want to see the explanations, and they don't want to see a typical matching score, but they want to understand why they get the recommendations. And third is, of course, the actionable insights. What is it that they can learn from the labor market? The final design, here, design goal 1, exploration. How did we implement this? Mostly by many different filters and controls. You can filter by distance, you can filter as particular locations, but also the competences can be filtered out. Explanations are visualized, as you can see in a table overview. The top one is the overview. You see, so the blue dots represent competences that the job seeker has. The empty dots represent competences that he has not mastered yet. And so you see the competence match. You can then expand that view. And in that expanded view, you also see the details of the competences. End users can also filter them out. And there's the stars. And with stars, end users can move competences of interest to the front of the table. Actionable insights, of course, we already visualized the competence match, but in addition, inspired by the upset visualization technique, we show for each of the competences how often that competence or skill is asked for in the many different jobs. And of course, that gives additional information to the job seeker. And he can, for instance, see, okay, this is something that is asked for, I don't have it yet, so it might be an interesting training opportunity. We evaluated this in the final evaluation with 66 job seekers, very heterogeneous user groups, ICT users, but also users in training for construction and sales and non-native speakers. They explored the tool, they also filled in the recipe questionnaire, and there were open-ended questions to inquire about the user experience, and we logged all interactions. What we can see here in the results was overall the tool was well perceived. Definitely ease of use, confidence and trust, and explanations were also very much valued here. If we look at the breakdown between the groups, what we can see is that technical users in general were a bit more, the satisfaction was a bit lower. They had a lot of suggestions on how the tool can further be improved, small usability things that can be fixed. Perceived usefulness for the construction group was also slightly lower, and that's mostly due because it's quite complex. And it's very fine-grained competences, and the view often then of course becomes very expanded. And for non-native speakers, perceived accuracy was a bit lower, but there of course language is also affected. With age, we don't see many differences. 45 clusters were in general a bit more positive. Younger participants had higher confidence and trust. And if we then look at the interaction patterns, we can see that over these groups, the more technical users, they tried all the different features of the dashboard to the fullest extent. They tried to break the dashboard as much as they could. It didn't work. The other groups, they mostly interacted with more traditional map sorting by distance, by location, but not too much the favorites and the other more advanced features, which you can also see here in the interaction. What do we conclude? In general, we see that the explanations are a key factor here. They give insight to the end users. And also we see, and that was mostly from the open-ended questions, that many actionable insights were triggered. And actionable insights can also be, I see that in this region, actually, this type of job is much more requested, so there can potentially also be location-based job mobility. Personal characteristics, as I mentioned, there was not too much difference in the questionnaires, but of course, if you look at the interaction logs, there is more difference, and the interface may need further simplifications. What are some of our key takeaway messages? For us, we want to highlight the importance of the user-centered design process. We learned a lot from these end users. It's a complex material. You have way too many competences that don't fit the screen. So we used Ben Schneiderman's visualization mantra, first showing an interview, then drilling down to the details. Favoriting competences was also something that we learned from our participants. And the competence-based explanations, showing that competence match, showing these competence gaps, and then providing actionable job-related insights. What are our next steps? Now we start from a user profile. Our next step will be that instead of starting from the user profile, users can just type in the job title, some competences, and we will then show recommendations to better support these what-if scenarios. What if I would acquire this skill? What will then be the recommendations that I will get to then potentially even better support this job mobility, which is one of the ultimate goals of our project. Thank you very much for your attention.
Do you have any questions?
Thanks for the talk. The job market is, of course, two-sided, right? So there's employers as well. I was wondering if you thought about what that interface might be and what insights employers might get from the users of a system like this.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and this will be the next step. So the next step will be indeed making the opposite exercise, and hopefully, because we ultimately hope that by making that exercise, we can also enable employers to come up with better descriptions of what they actually ultimately would want in a job.
Is there a question over here?
First off, thanks for this interesting presentation. It seemed from the survey that it was mostly the users, so the job seekers themselves that you were asking the questions of. So did you also have the caseworkers or the mediators, I believe we called them, were they also participating in the survey as well? How did they take onto the technology if that was the case? Did they see it as a threat potentially for taking over their own jobs? Or?
It's a very good question. They were involved in the user-centered design process of focus groups and then the first prototype evaluations, I think, allowed studies. We didn't do the final evaluation with them. To them, I think they see it as a very useful tool, and even I think it has much more potential there. What we see there is it can be a great enabler for them, for the conversation. If they're having a conversation with a job seeker, it can be a great tool, because what they also particularly highlight is, and you see it also in the interaction patterns for technical users, is where, of course, public employment services, we have to make tools for everyone, and for technical, non-technical users, non-native speakers, this might be still too complex. That's also what they highlight. But then if they're there to facilitate, I think it can play a good role.
Any more questions? Over here.
Thanks for the lovely talk. Could you see the personal characteristics defined in terms of search tasks? Categories of users, I'm aware that that data is sensitive and difficult to collect, but could you see that as an expansion?
Would be a very interesting research direction. We definitely haven't looked at that yet. I also think that the current groups that we're testing with may not be diverse enough to do that, but would be a very interesting research direction.
More questions? Do we have any questions in the overflow room? We have another minute or two. I have a question. So do you have access to be able to look at the impact of this on getting, like, within 3 months, are your job seekers employed? Or opportunity to do recommendations, not necessarily for the job, but say, recommend a class at a local college that would help them expand their job market possibilities. They've been looking at those kinds of closing the loop.
It's all on the plan. So this will go into production in the upcoming months, and then it is the goal to look at what the impacts might be on finding a job. We're also making the link to trainings and to the training services that public employment services.
Thank you very much.